Good morning. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today for this webinar on generational giving. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Zuri Group is a full-service consulting agency that works exclusively with nonprofits, from peer-to-peer fundraising, website design and development, digital advertising, and Google Grants account maintenance to fundraising strategy, systems assessments and selections, full-scale CRM implementations, and everything in between. We are passionate about helping nonprofits use technology to build better relationships with their constituents and maximize their impact. My name is Lo, and I'm a digital marketing consultant here at Zuri Group, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat for your questions or technology issues today. For today's webinar, we're joined by Kim Everett. Kim has over 20 years of experience in client support, digital marketing, small business operations, and growth management. And as Director of Client Success at Zuri Group, Kim has helped hundreds of organizations with their peer-to-peer fundraising strategy and is experienced with implementation across many different platforms. So we're in great hands for today's session on generational giving strategies for P2P campaigns. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat today for questions, so please don't be shy. And Kim, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thanks, Lo. Okay, today's agenda will be talking through the generations. So I'm going to go pretty deep on explaining what makes a generation and some trends of charitable giving per each generation, and kind of talk about the similarities and differences within the generations and their giving trends. And then we'll go into applying that to peer-to-peer fundraising and strategies to communicate with and nurture and retain your donors and your constituents throughout the year. But first, I want to start with a poll. So choose which generation you identify with. So as you're voting, I'll just kind of move on here. You may feel like you're a Gen X. You may actually be a millennial, but feel more like you relate with Gen X's or whatever. So go ahead and vote on that. And what I wanted to start with is actually understanding the generations to talk about this. But it used to be thought that, or, sort of common thinking is that a generation is like a 20-year time range, or, a specific time range. And actually, generational researchers and experts say that it's actually more about distinct shared sociological experiences in a time frame. So, and it could be, a 20-year time frame or a 5-year time frame, but it's those shared experiences that make that generation as, a group that can be relatable to each other. So for example, World War II or the Great Depression or 9/11, those are large sociological experiences that people, they live through them in the same way. And so that's part of what defines a generation. One researcher calls it predictability by scenario. Kind of an interesting shift of thinking there. So it looks like we have our poll result. Cool. That is consistent with what I would think is the majority of the workforce these days are millennials and Gen X's. So that's great. So now we know who's on the phone here. I personally am Gen X. Go Gen X. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into that generational understanding here. So what I'm looking at is kind of this time range, and there's some overlap, and there's some if you look on the internet and Google the generations, you'll get a whole bunch of different articles that say a whole bunch of different things. But I chose this one because I think it has the most relevance per the shared sociological experiences. So for example, the matures, the greatest generation, remember the Great Depression or were brought up shortly after the Great Depression. So, they have that shared experience of times are tough. And then getting into, they fought and died in World War II. Baby boomers were born in the boom after World War II when the soldiers came home from the war, and they're the ones that rebuilt America. They're like the hard workers that, are working sun up to sundown and rebuilt the country after the war. Whereas Gen X were originally kind of seen as slackers, And then as they've moved into adult years, they are, we are now, considered contributing members of society. But, some shared experiences that we've had: we've never fought in a war. We were typically raised in the suburbs, but with high divorce or single parent rates, which was kind of, new from the previous generation. We grew up with 80s pop culture, the fall of the Berlin Wall, end of the Cold War. We can vividly remember life before internet and cell phones and computers. And we want to be, productive members of society, but also our generation is the first one that introduced this concept of work-life balance. So then we can skip over Gen Y because it really just overlaps with other two generations, and nobody really, it doesn't really have any core shared experiences other than what are already in the other generations. So then going on to millennials. So millennials can remember before 9/11. So 9/11 was a pivotal distinction in this group, and they grew up in the rise of technology. So they're not just tech savvy, but actually tech dependent, and they have a hybrid status. They can remember analog and digital, and could be seen as great people to employ as what I like to call translators between the younger generations and the older generations. The other interesting thing about millennials is that they're getting their first career job up to 5 years later than previous generations, and they're staying in college longer. And then now moving on to Gen Z or iGen, they were raised, or are being raised post 9/11, and that was a real shift in our society, that now the world feels more like a scary and unsafe place. They also have been alive during that pretty big recession a couple of years ago, and also they are exposed to more diversity. So because they have so much access to information on the internet and sort of about the world, they have a more global view, a more diverse view, and in fact they're so diverse that they don't even notice diversity until it's absent. So that's an interesting dynamic there. And this is also the first generation of tech natives. So they had exposure to screens as babies. They intuitively know how to do things that we had to learn as adults. The average teenager consumes 9 hours of media, of screen time per day, which I thought was a rather shocking statistic. But anyway, they're socially conscious of global issues, again, because they have just all that access. And they're really, seen as the ones that are going to innovate and change the world. So, the other interesting thing about this, if you think about their shared experiences, they don't remember a time that they could not see the person they were talking to. So, they don't remember a time before FaceTime and video chat. So, when you think about that, it's kind of, I take pause when I think about that. And the other thing is, so, kind of an example of the innovation and, they're changing the world. I have a friend whose 9-year-old boy watched YouTube videos and taught himself how to play piano in 6 weeks. So, these kids are doing things that we sort of never dreamed of. My piano teacher would be impressed, but anyway. So, okay, a couple other things about that are interesting to note about the generations. The researchers say the rate of change is going to increase because the rate of technological development is going to become more rapid, and things change faster, and new experiences or new shared experiences are going to change more rapidly. So their argument is that because of that, the generations are going to become more compressed. So instead of maybe a 20-year time range, it might be 5 or 10. And then the new generations bring the rest of the generations with them. So an example of that is if you think about Facebook and how the first adopters to Facebook were the younger, the millennials and the younger generations. And then as they started using it, so for example, they get married and they have a baby, and their parents and their grandparents are like, oh, when are you going to send me the baby pictures? And then the kid says, oh, well, I posted them on Facebook. So now the parents and the grandparents are like, well, if I want to see pictures of my grandbabies, I guess I have to join Facebook. And so now, now actually the largest users of Facebook are the baby boomers and the matures, and the younger kids are like, oh, well, now Facebook's not cool anymore. Let's go use Instagram or Snapchat. But anyway, so it's kind of interesting how the sociological factors affect the technology usage and how it brings people to them. So, all that being said, even if you think, oh, well, I don't need to be, on Instagram because right now it's only Gen Z using it, well, that probably will change. In fact, I just set up my mom's Instagram account, who is 70, so that she can go see my niece's pictures from camp. So there you go. There's another example. So keeping pace with those digital outlets is going to just continue to be important. And then, going back to those Gen Zers, there's a, sort of a distinct mentality of wanting to change the world. They're so conscious of global causes that they want to change the root cause of problems in the world. They don't just, for example, they don't just want to volunteer at a food bank. They want to use their time, energy, and resources to work towards sustainable global access to food. So, that's a shift, and making a difference is more important than money. That's another shift probably from, baby boomers and Gen X, money is a little bit more important, and it seems to get less important as you go down that generations. The other interesting thing about Gen Zs wanting to change the world is that 72% of them want to start their own business or somehow be in an entrepreneurial or creative position when they enter the workforce. So I think that's going to be definitely something to watch, and keep trying to figure out how to find them where they are. So let's apply now the generational differences to charitable giving, because we do have some pretty distinct groups here where the greatest generation, or the matures, are they're still giving the most per person, but the baby boomers, if you look at the total pie of all donated money, they're still giving the most of that pie. They are a large, population-wise, a large generation, and that is expected to stay dominant for about the next 5 or so years. Gen Xers are approaching prime giving years, so we're actually, and also because if you look at the difference between, whether we're just defining generations as 20-year time blocks, or we're actually using the shared sociological experiences model, if you use the latter, the Gen X population is actually only 2% smaller than millennials, and millennials is about 67 million. I've heard millennials that it's said it's up as much as 80 million, but that's again using sort of a different model of calculating generations. So anyway, so our Gen Xers are giving, sort of the being the biggest givers as we move through our careers and amass wealth. We're looking at about 10 years away from being the biggest group. And then millennials are still, even though they're in early stage of career and still in college and starting into the workforce later, they're still, about 14% of total giving, which is, significant and going to keep growing. So as they move through their stages of life, that's just going to go up. So now the Gen Zers are still typically in school or in very early stages of career. So they currently represent 2% of total giving. But they will likely, as they move through their careers and as they move through their stages of life, they're likely going to have a transformative effect on giving trends. So another interesting trend when we talk about giving trends is that of the total amount of money being donated, that amount is rising, but it's being given by fewer people. So, so that's kind of an interesting thing to be aware of, because what that says to me is that retention is going to become increasingly important. So it already is important, and nurturing your donors and good donor, good constituent stewardship is critical to the success of of your agency, but also it's even going to become even more important. Okay, so let's look at how people give. I think I mentioned earlier about, money. Well, this holds true with the older generations. Prioritize donating money, so they prioritize making money and donating money over, things like volunteerism, whereas the younger generations are choosing more volunteering, more word of mouth, more advocacy, more peer-to-peer, things like that. So the thing that's interesting, that I think that's interesting to note here, is that peer-to-peer fundraising draws upon all generations, but in different ways. So the actual walkers and bikers and event participants are more likely to be Gen X or younger, and then the most likely to sponsor those athletes are the boomers and the matures. So it's one of the few instances where there's this sort of generational cross-section of the data. And as always, with peer-to-peer events, it requires a strong focus on welcoming and nurturing, and making sure the new donors who may not be familiar with your cause learn more about it and get engaged. So the other interesting thing to note, and I think is worth paying attention to on your website, is making sure you are emphasizing your financial responsibility. The younger donors are researching causes are more likely to go online to learn about the causes they are considering. 60% of Gen Xers say they use Google as part of their research efforts. I'm part of that 60%. Millennials and Gen Z are much more likely to use social media for their due diligence than their elders. So it's continuing to be important, and especially with the younger generations being so concerned about sort of their global consciousness and that sort of thing, they're also going to be continue to be concerned about what portion of their donations go to overhead. So following from that, I did a little analysis of the data surrounding what motivates people to give. So there are two mindsets that are universally important: a sense of personal responsibility and a concern about financial stewardship. So that strong sense of responsibility to help others is, sort of the defining value for all generations, and underpins nearly all of that charitable activity. Donors of all demographics express concern about how their charitable dollars are being spent. So that's just sort of across that's human nature, if you will. And then the other mindsets vary in importance. So, for example, older donors are more likely to say they plan their giving as opposed to being spontaneous. So, they're the planned giving where they give a check annually to the same charity or that sort of thing. That's more of a mindset of the older generations, whereas the younger generations are more likely to just kind of be compelled to give spontaneously because they saw the need, or they watched a compelling video or something like that. Younger donors also place a higher value on gaining recognition and or thank you gifts as rewards for their donations. And this is interesting too, that recognition is low on the list for older donors versus younger. I would also argue that it's still important overall for everyone, even though they say it's low. I think it's human nature that we all like to be, recognized and appreciated. And so what I would say about that is that maybe it's different ways. So, maybe the matures and boomers don't necessarily want to be called out individually, but might want to belong to like a VIP club or the gold tier of donors, or, something like that, sort of gives them that sense of, yes, I'm part of this community of donors. Whereas the younger generations, may actually want the thank you directly, the thank you gift, or the recognition on social media or something like that. So it's kind of an interesting difference between the two, but also I would not say, oh, you don't even have to bother recognizing your older ones. So that's not what I would want this slide to portray. Okay, so then let's look at donation channels, because I think this now gets into the how, right? So we've been talking a lot about trends and sort of theories and principles, and now let's talk a little bit about, okay, so how do we reach these people? So what you see on that top green line is that direct mail is going down. Not so shocking. Interesting little anecdote about this. My millennial coworker thought this was email, and rightfully so. Email is important and active, and also not called out separately on this graph. And he was like, no, it can't be mail. It has to be email. I'm like, well, actually, people do still, nonprofits do actually still send out mailings, and it's still a thing. And actually, across all generations surveyed, it's still an acceptable way to be asked, but it is, decreasing in effectiveness. Whereas the online through website, and that includes the website itself, email campaigns that drive people to the website, newsletters, social media that drives people to the website. So sort of anything where the traffic is being driven to the website, that has remained pretty constant. But it's interesting that nothing has kind of risen to fill the gap between what mail has dropped in, and then nothing has sort of bridged that gap. Even social media. So this is kind of interesting, because if you just look at this graph and you think, okay, well, social media is not really killing it, but I think it just remains to be seen. I think we're in the early stages, and that the trends that we're seeing with Facebook donations now, and now the Instagram donate sticker being added, those are probably going to increase a lot over the next few years. This data is through 2018, and the Instagram sticker didn't even come out until this year. So I think a lot of what we can extrapolate from this is that donations via social media are going to rise, and we just don't know how much yet, because it's pretty early to tell. It didn't even exist 8 years ago. So that's social media. And then, and also if you look at it from the generations, 21% of Gen Z and 17% of millennials donated via social media. And again, if you watch what the younger kids do, that's probably going to be where the trend goes, right? So we think this is a growing trend. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out is SMS texting does not look like it performs well. And, you could even say, oh, wow, downward trend, like, is it just going to go away? Except that I think what this is looking at is maybe what we're not doing right. So the question, whenever you look at data, right, I'm always like, does this data tell you the story of what the trend is going to be, or does it tell you what we're currently doing? And I think this tells what we're currently doing, and that we're not doing it right. So what I mean by that is, if you look at traditional text to give, is actually the model of that was through the phone carrier, right? So American Red Cross would put out a widespread message saying, you know, Hurricane Relief Fund, donate now, and people could donate limited amounts of money. It wasn't unlimited, but it was, you know, something like up to $25 through their phone carrier. And the phone carrier would actually charge them on their next bill and then give the money to the agency, to the organization a couple months later. And that also kind of presents some challenges with the timing of it. But you know, you don't get data on the donor. You don't get the chance to nurture them. You don't get the chance to ask them for a recurring gift. It's just sort of a one-time limited deal, and you get a check. Now, that is what I think that isn't going to be effective going forward. But what could be effective going forward is collecting people's cell phone numbers and starting to nurture them, right? So sending messages having to do with advocacy or, learning more, just sort of they're following your events, or they're following your postings, kind of like social media. But, and then somewhere down the line, making me ask, or asking them if they'd like to sign up for, recurring donations or that sort of thing. And then what I like to call that is text to donate. So then you're giving people, a link to your online donation form that of course is mobile responsive. And that you are then sort of, it's another channel to sort of feed them into the website donations. And so that's where I think that's heading. And actually there's quite a bit more to it than that. And there's also some other interesting trends about voice automations and other uses for the SMS. So if you're interested in that topic, Zuri Group did just do an office hours last week on the topic, and we'll send a link to the recording of it. It's quite fascinating. I learned a lot from my colleagues about these trends. So we'll send a link to that in our follow-up email after this. Okay, so other emerging trends. Workplace giving. Okay, so if you don't already have relationships with local companies that either help bring teams to your events or promote your mission, or maybe you get volunteers that way, please consider beefing up your workplace giving strategy, your corporate partnerships. The interest in workplace giving is higher among millennials and Gen X than any of the other generations. Partially that's because that's who's in the workforce, but also this may speak to an emerging opportunity to reach those people where they are, and we are at work. Another interesting tidbit about that is that millennials are more apt to work for a company or an organization that they feel matches their own beliefs and values and the causes they support. So that is, millennials are factoring that in when they decide to take a job at a company. And then I think we mentioned earlier, younger donors are especially concerned about seeing the impact of their donation. And, again, it's this like consciousness of global impact, right? And so that's something to be aware of, and make sure you're reinforcing, the impact. And then the mobile device, that number actually seems low to me, but it's likely to increase. And I think it's been beaten into everybody's brains over the last few years that your website and your donation forms and your event sites and all that need to be mobile responsive. If they're not, then that's something to work on, because that mobile donations are just going to continue going up. And then SMS texting has generally been seen to be less effective for donations than for advocacy, but I think there's real opportunity there, as I discussed on the last slide. Okay, so getting into the communication piece of how to communicate with the various generations. So let's talk about this marketing rule of 7. So if you're a experienced marketing professional, you've probably heard this before, but the concept is, and it actually dates back to the 1930s when the movie studios were trying to figure out how to get people to, motivated to go see their movies. They researched it and found that someone needs to hear, see, read, interact with, whatever the medium is, your brand or your message at least 7 times before they'll take action to buy or donate or whatever action you want them to take. So this is a psychological phenomenon that still holds true today. It's called the mere exposure effect, or also known as the familiarity principle. And it essentially is that the more people are exposed to something, the more likely they are to take note of it and develop a preference for it. So, what does that mean to you? Well, that means to you that, continuing to market to people in all the various methods that, finding them where they are, right? So whether it's social media or mail or email, newsletters, or, whatnot, that it's still important. And in fact, increasingly important to have a really good strategy to cut through the clutter, because people are getting inundated with information and, sort of inbound emails and whatnot. So you need to have a good generational strategy. You need to use impactful images and video. And we're going to go into these things in a little more detail here in the next couple slides. And then also a focus on your content and your storytelling and your mission messaging. So let's apply some of these concepts to peer-to-peer fundraising. How do we do these things? What are some of the common concepts that make a successful event and get the message out? So again, I'm saying that I think peer-to-peer fundraising is a great cross-section across the generations. That they do appeal. The peer-to-peer events appeal to different generations in different ways. So you want to leverage that. You want to make sure you're using cutting-edge digital technology that is mobile responsive, is easy to register, easy to donate, easy to share the event for the the people who are the participants. And in the next slides, we'll dive a little deeper into these elements. So starting with the nurturing and the coaching, and again, this is with a peer-to-peer fundraising event, you're going to be approaching different people different ways. But the common theme is that a successful event does require a fair amount of effort on the staff's part and on the volunteers' part to make sure that they understand it, that they're engaged. And it may seem obvious that you ask them to fundraise, or actually it may seem obvious that it's like, well, yeah, it's a fundraiser, like duh. Except that 50% of $0 fundraisers say they were never actually asked to fundraise. And if you think about it, peer-to-peer fundraising, that's a term that we in the industry know and understand and use, but outside the nonprofit world, people might not know what that means. And they aren't, if it's their first exposure to a peer-to-peer fundraising event, they might not realize that they're actually supposed to do something other than show up. So, make sure that's clear when they're signing up, or, with various communications to your fundraisers along the way during, sort of the pre-event ramp up, and just make sure it's in all your communications, that there's an expectation that they'll fundraise, that that here's the impact of the fundraising, here are tips on how to fundraise, and that sort of thing. And then ask them to tell their story. So, if you're providing them with event templates, maybe you ask them to update their fundraising page to share how they connect with your mission. And then also ask them, as part of their fundraising efforts, ask them to share on social media, email, text, whatever they're doing, wherever, whatever mediums they're using, have them, reach out that way. And then the other thing is, ask them to include their parents and children. So, again, this cross section of the generations, their parents may not, want to come to the event or be part of the event, but they'll probably donate to it. And, their children, if they have children, having them, bringing them to the event or having them at the finish line or, whatever the situation is, exposes those younger generations to that personal responsibility, to your mission, to, nonprofits in general. So it's a good kind of, laying the groundwork for future generations to be, socially conscious and potentially even your supporters. So then we get into the storytelling piece of, how, kind of this, how to communicate, how to cut through that communication clutter, how to have visually impactful messaging. Because the millennials and the Gen Z have grown up with these screens. They're consuming content on screens all day long, and they're used to visual imagery. They're used to at a glance visual imagery. You only have 7 seconds to capture people's attention, and if you have a lot of data or a lot of information you want to share, consider using infographics, because they're a great way to combine the data piece with visually stimulating either icons or just graphics. Like, this doesn't even have a ton of icons on it, but it's got some good graphical elements that pop and kind of draw your eye. So people are more likely to be, this versus like a bullet pointed list of stats, it's more likely to grab people's eye, and they're going to stay on the page longer because they're going to try to decipher it, versus just text where you're like, okay, blah, 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 text, and you skip right over it. So, so this is, this is an example of a Big Brothers Big Sisters one, and the, it's showing the outcomes and the impact. And so again, this mission messaging where people want to know impacts, they want to know outcomes, they want to know where, how their money is used and what effect it has. So same thing. So, images, so infographics and images are important in capturing people's attention and engaging them. And then video is becoming even more important. So, video should inspire, engage, inform, really grab their attention. If you want to make, you want to make your videos start right off the bat with grabbing people's attention, as opposed to a long, sort of introductory prologue. And, these stats are pretty compelling. I mean, 75% of people say video is most influential when deciding whether or not to donate. Over half of people who watch a video online make a donation. And those Gen Zers who don't do a lot of, planned giving, 33% of them would give unexpectedly after watching a compelling video. So that's definitely, keep in mind for, how you're going to be putting your videos out there, pairing specific scenes with the right music and the right people can really play on people's emotions and draw them into your story, and really deepen their connection with your cause. So along those lines, if you don't already have a YouTube channel for your organization, consider setting one up, because YouTube, surprisingly, I just learned this statistic from L'Oreal's blog post that she wrote a couple months ago, which we'll also share a link to, because there's more information and tips in there about the YouTube channel. But It is the second largest search engine now. 1.5 billion people and more than 3 billion searches a month. It reaches more of those Gen Z and millennials than any other cable network in the US. Again, I already kind of touched on this, that videos help you emotionally connect with your audience. And on average, viewers spend over an hour a day watching YouTube on their mobile devices alone. So that's pretty amazing. And really, so the barrier most people might think is, oh, I, have to produce these, 30-minute professional quality, I've got to hire somebody, or I've got to pay an agency an arm and a leg. But actually, you really don't. I mean, and people even, I think, respond more favorably to non-professional, not overly produced, just, real connection, real video. So you can make them any length. You can just make a 2-minute snippet. And, anybody with a decent smartphone could make a pretty decent video. The other trend to watch as far as video goes is live streaming. So, if you had the ability to live stream your fundraising event, that's a great way to draw in people who, were not able to make the event. And if you don't think live streaming is popular, you might want to check out Twitch, which is the world's leading live streaming platform for gamers. Talking about, other ways to communicate, the social media channel, as I mentioned, we think is going to continue to grow. So be sure when you're doing your events and you're getting the word out, provide your fundraisers an easy to use mobile friendly tool. Make sure you're pre-populating everything you can. So the page templates, the email templates, the thank you messages, put compelling text about your mission in all of those places, and things people can use that they can just quick, grab it, go, make a few edits, send, and show them how to use it. So and this is one that I think I know locally. So I'm on the board of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Central Oregon, and we did our fundraising event, our Bowl for Kids' Sake event, for the first time on a peer-to-peer mobile platform this year. And it was a shift. I mean, you do have to show people how to use it. And particularly the older generations, you may have to either do it for them and, basically just like sign them up and send them a link, or like, sit side by side with them with their phone in their hand and show them how to do it. With the younger generations, that won't be as much work. I'd say, Gen X, millennials, and down are going to be fine if you just send them a link and say, register now. But definitely keep that in mind as you're moving into that new technology. The older generations are going to need a little help with it. And then the other thing to, really hopefully call out with especially your younger donors, your younger generations, is that those small donations do matter. So, a lot of the younger generations will be like, oh, well, I'm not going to fundraise because all my friends are just poor college students. Well, if you send them a link to your site and it has a really compelling video, and they might just give you $5 or $10. And if, 10 of your friends give you $5 or $10, well, then, that's a pretty decent reach. And, the small donations matter, number one, and number two, the goal is this outreach and familiarizing people with your mission, and your fundraisers or your, event participants help with that, kind of like ripples in the pond expanding. The other thing about, leveraging social is, on the day of the event, make sure you have everything you need for people to broadcast it to their, sphere of influence. So, set up a selfie spot at your event that has like really good lighting and a great background, and encourage people to take photos of themselves and their teams and all that good stuff, and post it on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever they're doing. The other thing, that you can leverage in social media is the social media ads. And this broadens your reach. So I just had this conversation with a Big Brothers Big Sisters affiliate, because they're basically saying, well, we're just kind of marketing to ourselves. All of our social media followers are just our bigs and our board members, and we want to broaden our reach. So one way to broaden reach is to use the advertising tools on the various platforms, and just make sure you're using them the way your constituents are using them. So, for example, you want to make sure you have these great, compelling images of shiny, happy people participating in your event, action shots, videos, age appropriate target audience, this sort of thing. Small amount of text, keep it whatever the way the people are using it, you want to use it the same way, right? So maybe in Instagram, you want to use the photo filters, or in Snapchat, you use the little animations, or that sort of thing. So kind of keep in mind finding people where they are and mirroring the way they use those tools. Okay, and then the elements of competition, incentives, and gamification can really add a lot of engagement to your events. So, one thing with competition is that you can actually get people's competitive spirit going by having, teams or companies competing against each other. So, maybe you find two local coffee shops to compete against each other, or, breweries or bike shops, or, whatever, banks, or, whatever local retailers you have relationships with. See if you can kind of spur them into more action to compete with each other. And statistics show that teams raise more than individual participants. So if you have a team element in your event, really nurture those team captains, see if they'll get involved in competition, and then make sure you're showing leaderboards and top rankings and that sort of thing, to kind of show it to people so they get engaged, they're checking back to make sure they're still in the lead, kind of thing. And then with regards to gamification, so, things you can do there is earn badges. I mean, people love playing games on their phone. So maybe there's a way you can make your event into something where they have, the games that they can play with the, earning of stars or badges along the way. And then with incentives, that can also be part of that gamification. So maybe there's quick win or early incentives for reaching a fundraising milestone. And that really helps keep people motivated. If they, reached 50% of their fundraising goal, then they get a hat or something. That has shown to be pretty effective, especially with the younger generations who are actually the fundraisers. And just a note there that the competition can be a lot of fun, but also make sure it doesn't overpower the story of why we're doing this. We're competing to raise money for the cause. So, okay, so on to post-event. Okay, so now you've communicated with people, you've engaged them with video, you've supported them along the way, and now afterwards, here's where we've got to focus on retention. So be sure you're thanking your participants through the appropriate channels, and that can be, recognition of people who reach their fundraising goals on social media, and, emails to everyone saying thanks for your participation. If you had the bandwidth to do handwritten notes to certain subsets of fundraisers, that one is actually, I like handwritten notes across all generations, because the older generations, it reminds them of like the good old days when people were polite and, said please and thank you and sent thank you cards for everything. And then the younger generations, it's just a novelty. Like, we just don't get very much personal mail anymore. We don't get letters anymore. So to get a handwritten thank you letter or card in the mail is a novelty and will make an impact on them. So be sure to do your reporting and analysis right away after your event while it's still fresh in your mind. Surveys are a great way to, get feedback on the event and, make some changes based on those the feedback in those surveys. That, studies show that the fundraisers who come back year after year, they raise 3 times as much the second year as they did the first year. And, sending their survey, getting their feedback, they feel heard, they feel invested, they feel engaged. They come back next year and raise more money for you. And then, following from that is that off-season outreach. So, have a year-round communication strategy to keep people engaged and informed about your mission. And, that speaks to that retention. And then, in that off-season outreach, make sure it's including a lot of your compelling mission messaging, that, the story of the outcomes and just, kind of the reinforcement of why this matters. And then if you have an event that has teams, use that feedback and your reporting and analysis to tweak and make your coaching and your, event materials that much more clear and strong and helpful to people. And then the other thing, we see organizations responding to retention challenges by diversifying. So, maybe adding different peer-to-peer, creative, non-traditional events throughout the year. Maybe they complement the traditional walks, runs, and rides, or maybe it's, just a birthday fundraiser, or somebody who likes to play cornhole has a cornhole tournament, or who likes to watch their favorite sports team has a, sports team fundraiser, watch the game type event. So really anything that any of your constituents are interested in, or any of their hobbies, could actually be turned into a DIY fundraising event. So just be sure you have the technology and, good platform for them to do that on, to support it. Okay, we've come to the end. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I know I've used up the full hour here pretty much, but I get excited about both the generational stuff and the peer-to-peer fundraising. So, when you put the two of those topics together, you can't shut me up practically. But anyway, I hope that you've come away with a few little tidbits of information that you didn't know before. If I had to say, here are the things I want you to remember, it's, you can still focus on the largest giving generations today. Your boomers and your matures are still very relevant in your, constituent nurturing strategy. But also, consider investing in relationships with millennials, as people who can help bridge the gap between the older and the younger generations. And if you're not already very serious about retention, and you have year-round communication strategies and welcome email series for any new person you get on in your database, and those kind of things, that's going to be increasingly important. Consider more of those workplace partnership programs, because workplace giving is a rising trend, and keep pace with the new digital outlets. So if you're not already testing and adapting into things like Instagram or having a YouTube channel, those are, good directions to head in. And then just keep your ear to the ground and listen to your donors and find them where they are. Okay, L'Oreal, do we have any time for questions, or are we pretty much out of time?
We're right at the end, but definitely if you have a question, please feel free to submit it. If we don't get a chance to answer it, we can definitely follow up after with you via email. Kim, thank you so much for breaking this down for us and giving us so many actionable strategies. I was over here scribbling notes during the section about the asking. All of those tips that you gave were such great ideas for email nurturing series that follows up with them and sends them each one of those additional asks. So I have lots of action items coming out of this. This was really great. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. If you'd like to be notified when we have new webinars, packages, or integrations like our Classy plugin for WordPress, you can sign up for our mailing list at zurigroup.com/subscribe. I also popped that URL into chat for you. And we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.